Jaki jest punkt wyjścia dla innowacyjnych produktów i usług? Potrzeba, przeczucie, idea i ludzie, którzy powiedzą: to możliwe, zróbmy to.
Ale entuzjazm to nie wszystko. Potrzebujesz maszyn i narzędzi.
Potrzebujesz materiałów i przestrzeni do próbowania.
Przestrzeni do zmieniania i próbowania na nowo.
Potrzebujesz w każdym punkcie skończonego produktu lub usługi.
I miejsca, by je skończyć.
A potem
Pokazać ludziom, przetestować i poprawić.
aż trafisz w punkt.
Dzień dobry Państwu. Bardzo mi miło Państwa powitać. Tutaj widzę na ekranie, że ciągle przybywa uczestników, wobec czego będę miała do Państwa kilka słów tytułem powitania i przedstawienia, czym jest LAB150, a w międzyczasie liczę na to, że więcej osób dołączy i będziemy już w komplecie. Discovery Event to wydarzenie, które dzisiaj otwieramy premierowo z wyjątkowym gościem. Bardzo się cieszę, że Bill Burnett jest z nami. A cały event i cała ta konferencja, którą rozpoczniemy, jest swego rodzaju taką kroczącą konferencją, która co 3 tygodnie będzie prezentowała różnych ekspertów i różne prelekcje. Więc zachęcam Państwa już teraz, abyście co 3 tygodnie włączali się w kolejne nasze prezentacje i mogli poznać to, czym jesteśmy. Chcemy mówić dużo o innowacji i czym jest innowacja. Dla mnie innowacja jest na pewno poszukiwaniem, jest też otwarciem się na nowe, pozamykaniem jakichś starych nawyków i starych przyzwyczajeń. Ale jest też aktualizowaniem wiedzy, jest też wsłuchiwaniem się w innych, w potrzeby innych oraz w to, jakie są wymagania otoczenia. To też pewna mentalna otwartość na to, żeby w ogóle przejść przez proces zmiany, który często jest trudny, bo wymaga od nas właśnie przekwalifikowania, zmiany myślenia, zmiany otoczenia. Aby te innowacje mogły się spełniać, potrzebnych jest kilka rzeczy. Na pewno potrzebne są narzędzia, na pewno potrzebny jest właśnie proces i na pewno potrzebni są ludzie, którzy pomogą nam przejść przez te skomplikowane zmiany. I LAB150 ma być miejscem, które ma łączyć i być mostem pomiędzy naszymi ideami i marzeniami, a pomiędzy tymi wdrożonymi pomysłami i efektami tych pomysłów. LAB150 to jest także przestrzeń, to 3000 m². Teraz jesteśmy w bibliotece materiałowej, ale mamy tutaj również prototypownię wyposażoną w bardzo nowoczesny park maszynowy. Jest przestrzeń badawcza, gdzie możemy spotkać się z użytkownikiem i zapytać go o to, co myśli o naszym produkcie albo o usłudze. Jest też przestrzeń konferencyjna i przestrzeń biurowa. Ale poza tym, że jest to ta fizyczna, namacalna część, to mamy tutaj również pewnego rodzaju dynamikę, energię i pasję ludzi, którzy tworzą to miejsce. I tych ekspertów, którzy są zgromadzeni zarówno tutaj w labie, jak i wokół nas, będziecie mieli właśnie Państwo okazję poznać podczas kolejnych wydarzeń. I I ten proces, który może za Państwem podążać, a jednocześnie nadać kierunek Państwu działaniom, to jest coś, do czego chcemy Państwa zachęcić. I w Labie właśnie zajmujemy się przede wszystkim projektowaniem produktów i usług. I to wsparcie w projektowaniu, które warto odkryć i doświadczyć, to właśnie ta ścieżka, którą chcemy zaprezentować, czyli co 3 tygodnie będziemy prezentowali kolejnego eksperta, który odpowiada za kolejny etap w procesie projektowym. Dzisiaj w tej odsłonie So Let's Design mamy wyjątkowego gościa. Mam nadzieję, że to będzie dla Państwa inspirujący czas i dobrze zainwestowana godzina. Bill Burnett to kierownik programu Stanford Design, współzałożyciel Life Design Lab oraz współautor książki Dobrze zaprojektowane życie. Nasz prelegent doświadczenie rozwijał pracując z takimi firmami, które są na liście Fortune 100, a w Apple był na stanowisku głównego menadżera linii PowerBook. Nasz ekspert w swojej książce Dobrze zaprojektowane życie napisał, że prawdziwe szczęście możesz osiągnąć tylko wtedy, kiedy zaprojektujesz właściwe życie dla siebie. Mam nadzieję, że ten dzisiejszy event będzie również właściwie zaprojektowany, okaże się właściwie zaprojektowanym i że właśnie wyciągniecie Państwo z tego dla siebie różne pytania, inspiracje do tego, żeby być może wprowadzić zmianę także w Państwa życiu zawodowym lub prywatnym. So Bill, thank you again for accepting our invitation and for participating in our event, design discovery event. And as I already did a short introduction, I will not make it longer at the moment, and we will probably meet again on the Q&A session, because your presentation will take around 45 minutes, and then we switch to the questions. So if any of you have question, you can type it on the chat, and we will look for an interesting ones so that we can ask Bill at the end. And as we are connecting with Bill, who is in San Francisco, and it's 7 o'clock in the morning, I hope you had a big cup of coffee, and you have, yeah, okay, perfect. And you have full energy. So thank you again, welcome, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you for the invitation to come speak. Today I've got a talk I call the designer's voice, change your mind, change the world. And the designer's voice is actually the very first class we taught at Stanford with using design thinking and life design put together. But the way we speak is a reflection of how we think, and how we think is what we make. So I'm going to walk you through some ideas about design, and design is applied to our lives in the next 40 or 45 minutes or so. So please, as you think of questions, put them in the chat. I'll go through our process, and particularly the way we think, our mindsets, how designers think. I've got a couple of case studies from Apple and IBM because I think it's interesting to see what some of the big companies do, and then also some really interesting project from Stanford called Embrace. And then this notion of to change the world, you have to change yourself first. And of course, during these times of the global pandemic, I want to speak to how design responds to disruption. So again, I'm Bill Burnett, and with my partner, Dave Evans. Dave and I co-founded the Life Design Lab, wrote the books together. He's been a fantastic business and teaching partner for 14 years. But Dave is not here. Together we created I teach in the Stanford Design Program. We co-founded the Life Design Lab and wrote the book, Designing Your Life Together. The book Designing Your Life came out in 2016. It was relatively successful. We got on the New York Times bestseller list. It has been translated into 23 languages, including Polish, and all over the world. And then we wrote another book last year called Designing Your Work Life. And together we're exploring the concepts of how design and positive psychology and understanding ourselves better can lead to a life that is well-lived and joyful. In order to do that, you have to think a little differently, because to invent something new to the world, to create something, let's say like the iPhone, or when I was at Apple, I was working on the very first generation of laptop computers to create something new to the world where you have no data about the future. You need a process that can invent and innovate, even without having any knowledge of what we're trying to make. And so in order to do that, you have to think differently. You have to think like a designer. There's different kinds of thinking. Excuse me, we talk about design thinking at Stanford a lot because that's something we sort of invented. Before we called it that, we used to just call it human-centered design, designing as if humans matter. But it's not the only way of thinking. Engineering thinking is very powerful. If you want to build this bridge, just tell me how long the bridge is, how strong the steel is, and how many cars will be on the bridge. And I can solve those equations. And we say engineers solve their way forward because they have lots of data. If you're trained in business, you optimize decisions, you optimize your way forward. You look at two possible investments or two or three investments, and you look at their rate of return on capital or their profitability or their projections. You have figures of merit, as they would say in the business school, and you optimize the decision. Your data is not as precise as engineering data, but you can make good decisions by looking for the optimum or best case. I teach at Stanford. Stanford is a research university. Research thinking is very powerful. In research thinking, you create a hypothesis, then you create an experiment to test for one very carefully isolated variable, and then you run the experiment and you analyze the data. So we say in research thinking, you analyze your way forward. And in that case, again, the data has to be very, very specific. Otherwise, you just don't get anywhere with the research results. So solving, optimizing, and analyzing, very powerful ways of thinking, but they require data. If you want to build something new to the world, the new iPhone, the next generation computer, the next generation service, hotel service idea, you have to have a different process because you can't get data about the future. And particularly when you're thinking about your life, you can't get any data about the future of you. You can have some hypotheses, we call them how might we statements, and you can do some brainstorming to come up with options. But basically in design thinking, we say you have to build your way forward. You build to think, you make prototypes in order to test assumptions. It's very different from research and business because the assumptions come from the process, and the process starts with empathy. We believe that you don't start with the problem, you start with the people or the person. You do a deep dive on humans. In this case, if we're talking about life design, a deep dive on what do I need? As a human being, what do I need? What are my needs and wants? And what does the world need? What does the world need from me? Then we define or redefine the problem because if you can come up with a better problem, you have a much larger space for solutions. Then we ideate and come up with lots of ideas because we know from our research that if you have lots of ideas, you have better choices. And then this idea of building our way forward, building to think, we prototype and test. We build simple, low resolution prototypes to test our ideas. In life design, we start with empathy for ourselves and the world. Then we pick a problem we want to change. We come up with lots of ideas. Our main workshop element is we call the Odyssey ideation or the Odyssey planning, where we come up with 3 completely different ideas for our lives. And then we go out in the world and prototype by talking to people and collaborating. And I'll explain that more, but this is how I teach my students product design or service design or experience design. In life design, there's one more step. Call it accept. And if my partner Dave were here, my buddy Dave, he would say, you can't solve a problem you're not willing to have. In other words, you can't solve a problem until you're ready to start working on the problem. And that energy of that curiosity of how you could make things different, and the curiosity of starting with a problem and really diving deeply with your empathy to understand it is the first step in every process. And you probably know some people who complain about circumstances all the time, but they never do anything. Accept is about getting ready to do something. More importantly, if you want to change your mind, you change your mindsets. We start with curiosity because curiosity is the mindset of a designer that gives them the energy to try new things. We are naturally curious beings. It is one of our 3 intrinsic motivations. We don't need a reason to be curious. We're curious naturally. Now, sometimes our schooling and our companies and our experiences in the world have dulled our curiosity or made us think that maybe curiosity isn't worthwhile. But in the designer's mindset, we rekindle, we re-energize curiosity because it's the most important. Then we reframe problems to come up with new ways to solve them. Radical collaboration is about working with people in the world, because that's where the answers are. That's where the engagement is. Mindful of process, because in the design process, you're sometimes flaring. You're going out wider and wider to have more ideas. Sometimes you're focusing to zoom in on just a few ideas and test them, prototype them. And so you need to know where you are in the process. And a bias to action. We believe you can start working on a problem even before you truly understand it, because in the process of prototyping, you come to deeper and deeper understandings of your problem. So I'm going to make this statement, just because this is about change your mind, change the world. I can tell how you think by looking at what you make. Humans, from the time they emerged from caves to creating first nomadic societies, then agricultural societies, and then modern tribal societies of cities and countries and states and things. Ever since we emerged as fully human, we have been makers. We have made the built world. Everything around you is constructed, designed by someone, maybe poorly designed or poorly thought through, but hopefully the world that you see around you is full of beautiful and well-designed objects. And I can tell how you think by looking at what you make. I'll give you 3 examples of companies that are 2 examples of companies and a project my students did that I think are really interesting, because they show how changing your mind changes your environment. The first one, strangely enough, is IBM, a big, old-fashioned company. IBM is a large company, over 370,000 employees in 190 different countries. And IBM is almost over 100 years old, like 120 years old, and it's a very old company in technology. No one thinks of it as being an innovator so much recently. But there's been a massive transformation going on at IBM. And what happened was, in 2012, the CEO, Ginny Rometty, one of the most powerful women CEOs in the world, decided that IBM was not innovative enough and that its processes were not innovative. And she had purchased a company run by a guy named Phil Gilbert. And she went to Phil and she said, let's transform the way we think. We're kind of an engineering company and a sales company. We think about engineering and selling things. But I never hear us talking about people or customers or needs or wants. I never hear us talking about the emotions that drive, the decisions to do things, to buy products and make things. And Phil was a student of the process of design thinking. He had studied things like design thinking from the Stanford archives. We give away all of our materials. And he said, I'll do it. And since 2012, they have hired over 15,000 designers deployed to every corner of the IBM universe. And they have set up a system where everyone must learn to think like a designer. And in that system, people get a badge for different levels of designer. And they have badged over 125,000 internal IBM employees on the idea of design thinking. And all of the managers are measured by this metric. How many of your people have been trained? This is, as far as we know, the largest deployment in the corporate sector of changing your mind, changing a company from an engineering mindset where they could solve the problem if they have data, to a design mindset where they can move forward and innovate, even if they don't have any data about that future. And it's been amazing. The results have been phenomenal. It saves $20 million per project. It increases the portfolio profitability by 18 million. You're twice as fast to market, 75% reduced time with design time, and a 300% return on the investment they've made to transform the company. And the transformation is not complete. It's been, since 2012. Well, let's see, it's been 10 years, a little bit less than 10 years. And they still have a ways to go. But in the corners of this large company that are now thinking differently, they're massively more profitable and innovative. The company that I worked for 7 years, Apple Computer, is a really interesting case study because I think most people misunderstand Apple. When they think about Apple products, they think about things that are well designed, but what they're talking about is how does the design look? What is the external appearance of the design? And they think that inside Apple, all we do is talk about appearance and how to make things beautiful. But that's not what we talked about at all. So let me reveal to you how Apple thinks about products. And we'll use the iPhone, as an example. It's an older iPhone in that picture. Is really all that Apple does is create beautiful things, the aesthetics of the product, the industrial design of the product? They certainly do that. But that's not what they think about when they start. Under there's 4 layers to what Apple does when it designs a product. And this is how differently they think than every other company that I know of. Underneath how something looks is how you understand it, the cognition or the cognitive layer, the layer of understanding. When I take an action and do something, what is the logical thing for the next thing to happen? And Apple works relentlessly to understand the user and to match the user's mental model, cognitive model, to the cognitive layer of every piece of software and hardware that they make. But that's insufficient. If you think about it, for those of you who remember the introduction of the iPod, the introduction of the iPod was actually, if you study it, a complete failure. When it was first introduced, it was the most expensive MP3 player on the planet. The popular MP3 player at the time was called the Rio, and it cost $49, and the iPod cost $199, and everybody thought, what a silly thing. 6 months later, and by the way, after the iPod was introduced, the Apple stock dropped because it was considered a bad idea. But that wasn't what was really going on. 6 months later, Apple introduced the iTunes store. A song for 99 cents, deconstructing the album, making downloading music, which at the time was mostly illegal through sites like Napster, making downloading music legal and legitimizing it and creating an ecosystem where every record company would put their songs up on iTunes. That was the invention, not the device, the ecosystem. And they just rolled out the device about 6 months before they told you the rest of the story. So Apple's always working at the aesthetic layer, the cognitive layer, and the ecosystem layer. There's one more layer that's even more important, and that's the emotional layer. When I was at Apple, we never talked about making beautiful things or easy to use things or things that were part of an ecosystem. What we talked about was making objects of desire. We knew that if you had a desire for something, a love, a passion for something, that we would have you as a customer forever, and that we would have met an intrinsic need that all customers have for meaning and purpose in their purchase. We have a model, when we talk about needs, we say in need finding, there are 3 layers of human needs. The explicit are the obvious needs in the case of an iPhone or something. It's like a bright screen and a good battery. Implicit, just below the waterline, the things you can't see. This is what people think and feel when they use a product. What is their mental state? But even deeper than that is the meaning layer. And that's at the very, very bottom of the iceberg. And you get to meaning, which contains values, purpose, the story of your product or product journey. When you can get to the meaning layer and address very specifically what that is for the customer, then you have a product that resonates on all three levels. And in Apple's case, taking the iPhone, the explicit obvious needs are, bigger batteries, brighter screens. And every year or two, they issue bigger batteries, brighter screens, faster processors, very simple things. But everybody else does that too. The implicit things are, the reason Apple wants to make products that are simple is they want you to feel smart. It's very interesting in technical products. For instance, if you buy a dishwasher and you put your dishes in it and they come out dirty and it doesn't work very well, you say this is a bad dishwasher. If you buy a vacuum cleaner and you're vacuuming your rugs, but it's not picking up all the dirt, you say that's a bad vacuum cleaner. But if you have an Android phone and the software on it is confusing and you can't figure out how to open your address book or make a phone call, you say, oh, I must be stupid, right? We believe that technology products are, working the way they're supposed to, but if we can't figure it out, we blame ourselves rather than the product. In Apple's case, they make you feel smart because you can make it work. But deeper than that, they make you feel like you belong to a tribe. You belong to a group of people who are driven by these values of simplicity and beauty and meaning. And when you feel you belong to a larger group of people, authentically, it isn't just branding or marketing. When you authentically believe you belong, you've changed your mind. You've changed who you are. Again, I said, show me, I can tell how you're thinking by what you make. I can tell who you are by what you make. I can tell who you are by the tools you use to make your world work for you. And when you choose an iPhone over another phone, you become a person who seeks to express themselves through beauty, harmony, and feeling smart. I want to talk about a project that happened at Stanford. And this is about almost 10 years old now, I think. We have a wonderful class, which again is one of these multidisciplinary class where students from all over the university, you can be a design student, but most of the students in this class are not design students. They come from the business school, from the School of Education. Maybe they're studying to be a teacher or a business person. Maybe they're studying to be an engineer. Maybe they're studying to be a writer or a poet. But they can take this class and we teach them design thinking, how to think like a designer. And then we give them a hard problem. The class is called Design for Extreme Affordability. So it's working only in parts of the world where there are no markets. You can't make a product and sell it necessarily because you're working, maybe in this case, they were working in Nepal, in very, very poor villages where villagers are living on $1 or $2 a day. And they have no money for products, but they have many needs. And so we pull the teams together. Again, many students are not designers. We teach them enough design thinking and a design strategy, design process. And then we actually send them to Nepal to work on a project. In this case, their original brief, the group they were working with, there was an NGO in Nepal who was working on the problem of prenatal care for babies before they're born, and postnatal care, particularly for babies who are born prematurely. When babies are born early, and it's often the case in developing countries because of poor nutrition, lack of medical care, babies are born prematurely more in a higher percentage. When they're born, primarily they need to be in an incubator because they're so little they cannot regulate their body weight, and they literally die of hypothermia. So the original brief was, incubators cost $40,000 or $50,000 for from Western companies, could you make a low-cost incubator for hospitals so they could afford to have more incubators? Interesting problem. They worked in it for a while, then they went to Nepal and they met a doctor who took them to his hospital, and they said, we're working on low-cost incubators. And he said, well, that's a dumb idea. What are you doing that for? They said, well, that's what they told us that you wanted. He said, no, come here. Look at this ward. I've got lots of incubators. This is where we keep the babies. What do you notice? And one of the kids said, there's no babies here. He said, of course not. Babies aren't born in hospitals in Nepal. They're born in villages. They're born in huts and homes. Nobody has the luxury of coming, to the capital to have their baby in an incubator. At least not the poor people. He said, come with me, and they went on a 6-hour drive out to a village outside of Kathmandu, where they met a bunch of women, including women who had recently had babies that had died because they were born premature. They did their empathy research in these villages, and they discovered that, one, babies aren't born in hospitals, they're born in huts, and that the problem is getting the baby from the hut to a hospital where they can get, complete medical care. And not only that, but the baby is born, and of course the mother has many other children, so it's not like the mother can just get in a Jeep and go to the hospital. She's got all these other kids with her. So how do you solve this? They came up with a lot of different prototypes and a lot of interesting solutions. This company is now global. They make these products and distribute them all over the world. But essentially, they came up with this thing they call the baby wrap, which is kind of it's like a little infant sleeping bag. And then you see this thing called the warm pack. That's just a pack of salts, which if you throw in a pot of boiling water, and there's a pot of boiling water in any village anywhere in the world, will melt the salt, and then you slip it inside the sleeping bag in a protected area. And as it cools, it gives off lots of heat. In fact, it will keep a baby warm at exactly 98 degrees Fahrenheit for 8 or 10 hours, long enough to get the baby from the village to the hospital. And it's been an amazing transformation. I think over 400,000 babies now have been saved. And Jane Chen, the student who took the class just thinking she was going to take a class, was business. She was from the business school. And in fact, I think she had been working at some investment banks before she came to Stanford, decided to change her life because she changed the way she was thinking. And she realized she had a solution to a problem that could make the lives of women all over the world better. And she never went back to investment banking. She became the CEO of this company, and they've gone out and saved many lives. And one of the things I love about the story is they got the wrong problem. When they started, they got the wrong problem. But by doing empathy with the real users, with the mothers in villages who were having babies or had lost a baby, and by willing to challenge the structure of the problem. This isn't about incubators, this is about transportation. This isn't about low-cost mechanical systems. This is about something that's responsive to the needs of the baby. By changing their mind and changing the problem, they came across a much, much better solution. Okay, so those are the case studies. Let's go back to this idea of curiosity driving our energy into the system. How does curiosity work? Well, as I said, it's one of the intrinsic motivations of humans. Humans, I think the only other species we've noticed curiosity in are chimpanzees and apes, who will play with a stick and just enjoy playing with or experimenting with their environment in what looks to us to be curiosity. Designing your life is a 4-step process. I mean, there's much more we can talk about in terms of the life design process, but one time, I'll tell you a story. One time after the book came out, the first book came out in 2016, the Designing Your Work Life book came out in 2019, in February, at the end of February in 2019, and then immediately the COVID pandemic hit, and then all the bookstores shut, and that book hasn't been quite as popular for a bunch of reasons. But we were going around and we were talking about designing your life, and we happened to be invited to talk on a television show that was going to be aired in Canada. And we flew up to Toronto, and we were in the room preparing to go on this television show, and they had mics on us and all sorts of things. And the producer came back and he was looking very nervous. He said, look, we had a 10-minute thing planned for you, but we had an emergency news bulletin, so now you only have 2 minutes. You have to explain all of designing your life in 2 minutes. And so we can't do that. We're professors. It takes an hour for us to explain anything. And he said, well, if you can't explain it in 2 minutes, you're not on. We'll cancel your segment. He said, well, we'd really like to, help people understand what we're doing. So give us a moment. And we went back, and Dave and I came up with this. I think Dave came up with most of this because he loves coming up with frameworks. And the framework that we came up with to teach designing your life in just 10 words in 2 minutes is get curious, that curiosity mindset. That's the thing you had when you were 4 or 5 or 6, you were so curious and you never stopped asking why. Go back to that. Inhabit that child again. Talk to people. Talking to people is a way of prototyping. It's a way of experimenting. The science fiction writer William Gibson is famous for saying, the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. What that means is that if I go talk to somebody who's doing something I'm interested in, but they've been already doing it for years, maybe they're an expert, maybe they've been doing it for dozens of years. Talking to them is like traveling into my future. Understanding their story from their point of view is like me living in the narrative that they create. So talking to people gives us so much access to new information driven by our curiosity that then we want to try stuff. We want to build prototypes. Prototypes are simple and easy. It's fast to build. They're all about creating experiences. We're not just a brain on a body that walks around. We're an embodied intelligence. There's many neurons in your gut as there are in your brain. We're starting to realize that there's intelligence all throughout the body and that we explore the world and we touch the world. Boy, do we want to start touching the world again after this pandemic. That it's in interacting with the world through motion, through movement. Kinesthetic intelligence, emotional intelligence. Trying stuff activates these intelligences and gets us into the world in a way that no other method will. And then tell your story, because it's in storytelling that we complete the loop. This is, in fact, what we call a virtuous cycle. Get curious, talk to people, try stuff, then tell your story. Telling your story, creating your narrative, will be the way in which you not only explore the world, but reconnect to your curiosity, because every story will lead to a new curiosity, a new inquiry. And then you'll talk to people. And then sometimes when they tell you their story, you'll tell them your story. And that will result in more networks, more opportunities, more ways of exploring this idea of the world. You repeat this again and again. You take your curiosity out for a walk. And you repeat to get more engaged. And that is essentially how you design or redesign your mindset, your work, and your life. Change your story, and you will change your life. Change the way you think, and you will change what you make. When you change what you make, you've got a new story. And the world will engage in a brand new way, because the world is a somewhat naturally curious place. The world is a place full of other storytellers, people who want to engage and want to explore the power of radical collaboration. And when people get together around common ideas, that's how the world changes. As Gandhi said, be the change you want to see in the world. And what I, from my designer's lens, I say, make the change you want to see in the world. Because being and making are synonymous to me. That what I make is who I am. Lots of stuff goes on in my head. I got lots of voices in my head, and doubts and fears and thoughts that are daydreams or random and other thoughts that are organized and good. So nobody can see what's happening in my head, but they can see the thing I make. I write a poem, I paint a painting, I build a device to help infants stay warm. I create an app to connect cancer. One of my students in this year's class is creating an app so that young people going through cancer don't feel alone, so that they could talk to other people, but they could talk to them with privacy and with dignity, and not just on Facebook or something, because the experience of going through cancer treatments is so difficult and so personal, and the experience is so fragile that it needs a different container than the average social media. But my students discovered that by talking to students with cancer and talking to people and deeply, deeply being involved in their journey through this process of trying to cure themselves of a very scary disease. So be the change you want to see in the world. Make the change you want to see in the world. And you do that by connecting the dots, who you are, what you believe, and what you do. And when you can connect these dots, all of the research, and again, my work is all based on research. I teach at Stanford. I can't make things up. I can't just say, hey, connecting dots is a good idea. No, we see that in meaning and purpose, research on meaning and purpose, research on what causes people to thrive. The work of Martin Seligman in his book on thriving, the work of Haley Csikszentmihalyi, the psychologist who defined flow and flow states. We know that if you can connect who you are, what you believe, what you do together, if they're coherent, you can increase meaning making. And we do that by assigning 2 simple assignments in the book. Write a 250-word paragraph on what is your view of work, what is your theory of work, why do we work, what is work for? And then write a slightly longer one on your life view, what is life for, what is the meaning of life? When you have a life with some work in it and it's coherent, that the work supports the bigger picture of life, you've created your compass and you know how to move forward in the world in a way that is generative and positive. And that as you build your way forward, as you make your way forward in the world, your compass guides you to make decisions that are coherent with your life and your work view. Now, it's interesting when I have my students do this, or I have people who come to my, now Dave and I do workshops for students, of course, who do that at Stanford. And the Stanford Life Design Lab, I worked out a deal with the university, with Stanford University, that we would just give away our curriculum for free to any university that wanted it. And then all they have to do is come to Stanford, or now they Zoom into a virtual studio, and we teach them how to teach the class well. And then they get all the curriculum and all the slides and all the theory and all the citations and research. And they can do it for free at any university, as long as it's for a non-profit university. And now we're in 250 universities. And there's over 1 million students in those universities, potential. They haven't all taken the class, but it's a possibility of 1 million students understanding how to change their mind, to change who they are, to change their impact in the world. And that's the mission, right? Is to teach people to think like a designer. Not, doesn't mean you don't also sometimes think like an engineer or a business person or a researcher, or sometimes think like a mother or a father or a child or a student. But in the face of this crazy changing world, having a design mentality makes you more resilient, because you can always redesign no matter what the circumstances. Which gets us to the pandemic. Oh, I like that build. Let's do that build again. Yeah, the pandemic, designing your COVID life. Now, we don't have a book called Designing Your COVID Life, but we did take the book Designing Your Work Life, and we've recently added 4 new chapters to it, and it'll be re-released in October. And maybe, post-pandemic, it will be useful to people, because we noticed that in the pandemic, it was getting harder and harder to think like a designer. So we turned to the work of this guy, Dr. William Bridges, He wrote a book on managing transitions, and mostly he was talking about organizations, big companies trying to make a transition. But we liked one of his ideas very much. He said that, it isn't changes that does you in. It's change is not the same as transition. The change is the situation. The change is the global pandemic. The transition is the psychological process people go to come to terms with this new situation. So the change is what's happening on the outside. Transition, the thing that's happening on the inside, is what we have to work on and have to manage. And he said it doesn't go like, it goes like this. People said it's ending, the losing, the letting go. Okay, pre-pandemic, we were all having whatever happy life we were having. And then the pandemic hits and it's terrible. And now we have to wait. And then the new beginning, things will be different after we have vaccines and it's safe to come together again. He said, no, that's not how it works, actually. What happens is from the letting go of the old thing to the new thing, there's this big, big thing in the middle called the neutral zone. Now, I don't know about you, but when we locked down in March here in San Francisco, and then, everywhere else in the country shortly thereafter, I assumed this might take 2 or 3 months. And, some people maybe were more pessimistic. They thought it might take 4 or 5 months. None of us thought that it was going to be, 16 months, and still around the world, in India, in many, many parts of the world, the pandemic is raging. It's nowhere near under control. Here in California, we're about ready to loosen all of our restrictions. In the US, we think we'll have maybe no restrictions at all by the summertime. But it's not over for a lot of people around the world. And so we have to be sensitive to that. But his point was, you don't go from the old thing to the new thing without going through the neutral zone. And what we noticed as we started interviewing people, doing our empathy with people, is that they weren't thinking of it as the neutral zone. They were thinking of it as the waiting room. You know how when you're waiting for an appointment and the appointment's late and you just keep looking at your watch and you're getting more and more frustrated? When am I going to get my appointment? When's the doctor going to come? When's the dentist going to come? When is the person fixing my car going to come? If you're in the waiting room and you see and you hear yourself saying those kinds of things, you're going to drive yourself crazy. So think of it more like the neutral zone. And remember that I say to my designers, design only happens in reality. It only happens right now, right here, in reality. And in fact, that comes from a sign that we put over the design studio years ago. The big sign that says "You are here," and then every one of our books, if you take off the cover, has on it "You are here," because we want to remind people that design happens in reality. And you're in the neutral zone, not the waiting room. And so that reframe alone helps people relax, because there's many things you can do in the neutral zone. And one of those is to engage your acceptance. One of the things we noticed about 3 months into the pandemic, there was an article in the New York Times newspaper where they talked about how the nation was in grief. We were grieving for what we had lost. And maybe even grieving for the friends and family who had passed away because of the global pandemic. And we looked at one of the big, standard models out there for grief is the Kubler-Ross grief curve. You start with shock and denial. Something bad happens, someone dies, some tragedy occurs, global pandemic. You start with shock and denial, then you get angry about it, then you're bargaining. Well, maybe I could do this, maybe I could do that, and that didn't work, and then you go into depression. And all of us have faced that cycle through this pandemic, and you may be at different places. But the way out of the grief curve is acceptance that the event has happened, understanding that there's nothing you can do to change it, and getting ready to move on. So we couldn't help but notice that the 5th step of the grief cycle was the step 0 of the design cycle, accept. And then we noticed people who were struggling with the neutral zone were doing 3 different kinds of accept. One was they were oppressed. Oh, this is so bad, but I accept it. One was they suppressed it. Oh, I'll just be tougher than this. And then they accepted it. And the other but the better way would be to be engaged. How do we do engaged acceptance? And engaged acceptance is the reframe. It's the neutral zone, not the waiting room. And you can engage your curiosity. You can learn in the neutral zone, and you can move forward. So in conclusion, the key to this approach is that it's human-centered. We've tested all of these ideas on real people in the real world. And I know everybody wants to be more, more successful, exciting, cutting-edge, data-driven, innovative, adaptive, cloud-enabled. This conference is about, creating more innovation in the world. But how about we just try to be more human? Because that's where we'll discover who we are, and we'll see what we make. And if we pay attention to the right things, we can make a very beautiful world. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over for some questions. I think we've got plenty of time.
Okay, hello, Bill. Thank you very much. And indeed, we have some questions here. So the two that I thought we could connect. One question is from Mike, who is saying that he works in a US company based in Poland. And he says that the culture, the innovation culture, and the creativity in the US company is so present there. Whilst in Poland, at the same company, there is a lack of creation and the culture is very weak. And the second question that I can connect with that one is is it maybe connected also to the education? Because there is a question, how does US education support design thinking? So I think these two questions are a bit connected, and I was thinking, how could you answer?
Yeah, so in the case of U.S. education, right, we're working to spread design thinking to all universities, and we have spread the life design ideas and the curriculum to 250 different universities. But it is new. Our kind of teaching is very engaged. In most classes, you have a lecture. The professor comes in and does a lecture. Students take notes, and then there's a test, and then you're done, or maybe you work some problems and then you're done. We don't teach that way. We call that the sage on stage. I'm smart, you sit down and you're passive, you sit in the lecture hall and you listen to me. And then you repeat what I've taught you. That's a terrible way to learn. We know from research that less than 20% of the content is ever remembered. So we do project-based learning, which where we say, hey, design a coffee cup. Okay, now design a new keyboard. Now design, an interface for an iPhone. And by seeing what you make, I can see how you're thinking, and then I help you be more creative. So education, we also have a program to bring this kind of creativity and innovation education to the high schools and the middle schools. We have a K through 12 lab at the D school. So all of those are about changing the culture of education, changing the culture of work. In the case where Mike's working for a company that he sees a strong innovation culture in the US, not as strong a culture in Poland, well, fantastic. That's a wonderful opportunity to prototype. What kinds of simple prototypes could Mike run to try to create a culture of creativity in his organization? And it doesn't even have to start with big ideas. You can start with a small idea, like, let's all learn about brainstorming, and then let's brainstorm to have a really good birthday party for a colleague. And if that worked, then let's brainstorm to improve the coffee in the break room. Then let's have a brainstorm to think about some business process, like how do we get our expenses paid? If you change your behavior, you have brainstorming meetings instead of status meetings. You have workshops on problem solving instead of budget meetings. You'll change the culture. Very famous business professional in the U.S., Peter Drucker, likes to say, you can't do something new until you stop doing the old thing. So you literally have to change. You change your mind by changing what you work on. But it'll happen. It happens slowly. But once it gets going, people will enjoy being in a more creative culture, and that'll sustain going forward.
Mm-hmm. Maybe a question connected to that is also, can you hear me? Okay, sorry,
Yep,
sorry.
in here, no problem.
How do you explain that more traditional corporates are investing more time to implement a design thinking process, and the new culture, whilst there is still so much evidence, like IBM, that it works?
You know, companies are just collections of people. And I'd say here, let's take a really simple example. You, during the pandemic, you've been very passive, just maybe, Zooming into work or doing video. You haven't been going to the office, you've been staying at home. And like a lot of people, you've stopped exercising and you've put on some weight. So you're heavy now and you want to change. The research results say that, if 100 people decide to do a diet, 80 of them will fail to lose any weight sustainably in the first 3 months. It's hard to change. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying design thinking makes it easy. So if we can't even do something that's so positive, if you lose weight, you will live longer, you will feel healthier, you will be healthier, your blood pressure will go down, your resting heart rate will improve. You know all the benefits, and yet you do not make the change. You don't, and then maybe terribly, something bad happens, you have a heart attack. And then you go, okay, now I'm going to change. I don't think companies change until they have had their heart attack, right? Until their market is threatened, their profitability is threatened, the competition is become so intense that they can't compete. That's when they change. I wish it were different, but I think until the company has its heart attack, it will not change.
Probably we are struggling all with small or big heart attacks at the moment. So that's definitely a moment where we all think to redesign our private life or business life. And so I wanted to ask, when is the right moment, you think, to change your personal life or your business life? And how many times it happened also in your private life?
Yeah. Well, in terms of the pandemic thing, actually, knowing that behavior change takes 8 weeks to, create a new behavior, or 8 weeks to just to get rid of a bad behavior. My wife and I actually hired a coach and a nutritionist, and she gave us a new diet, and we met with her every week, and we've met with her for 5 months now, because it takes about 5 months before I can do this on my own. So I initiated a change, but because I know what it takes to make that kind of change, we put together a whole support structure so that we'd have support for 5 months to make a permanent change. And I've made many other changes in my life, but your question, the real question is, when is the right time? Now. You are here right now. This is the time you will change, or you will decide to wait until another time. But that's all about accept. Until you tell me, really tell me, I want to change something. And I'll say, no, you don't. You want to change. You want to change something, but you're not going to change something. I don't mean to sound, I did work on Star Wars toys. That was my very first job, is to do Star Wars toys. And I don't mean to sound like Yoda, but there is no trying to change. There's just doing a change. So accept is about doing, not thinking, not wanting to. Maybe I'll change, maybe I won't, I don't know. It's nice to talk about change. It makes me sound like a good person. But sit with me right now in this moment and tell me what you want to change. I know exactly how to get you there. Because the design mindset is about inventing the future. If you want the future of you to be different, accept a change, think differently, and with a bias to action, you start right now. It doesn't start any other time than right now. That might be in a week, that might be in a month, that might be after your heart attack. It's up to you. But change goes through a day that looks just like today. Or some other time in the future. I was talking to a friend of mine who has a bad habit. He's trying to get rid of it. And I said, so are you going to change it now? You're going to wait 10 years? You're going to wait till the day before you die? When are you going to do it? I mean, there's only doing it. You've been thinking about it for 20 years. Are you going to start today, and then maybe you'll live the next 20 years of your life, if you live that long, the changed person? Or are you going to wait for 10 more years and then you'll only live as the changed person for 10 years? Or are you going to wait till the day before you die and then you only live as the changed person for 24 hours? When do you want to start? Because you can't accomplish anything until you begin. And the beginning starts in reality, in right now, when you make a decision to accept that this is a hard problem, but I am going to change. That's it.
That's it, but that's not just it. I think it looks also very, very holistic. It's really about your mindset. It's about how tolerant you are to yourself and to others, so that you can also fail from time to time. But,
of course. I mean, we know from prototypes fail all the time. And every time, but a prototype never, it might fail to answer the question I was designed it for, but it never fails to teach me something, including that I haven't made enough of an effort, or including that I haven't accepted yet, or whatever. So yeah, it's simple and it's super hard. It's both at the same time. But what I'm saying must sound true, right? That if you want to, the step that happens before you start changing is you say, this must change. And now the only question is, how hard am I willing to work to change my mind, to change what I make, to change the world?
So if you say something about world, I would like to ask one last question, because you said something about human-centered design at the end, and I think we as humans are maybe too centered in the way of thinking that Earth belongs to us, whilst we know that we are now in a very big problem of ecology, and shall not also Earth be the part of the design and designing everything all around us, because it cannot move on the way we used to think, that we are really the kings on Earth and everything has to be designed for us. So what about Earth?
You're absolutely right, and the language of human-centered design, which came from a long time ago, really doesn't frame the problem correctly, right? And if you don't frame the problem correctly, you'll work on the wrong things. In order for us to thrive as human beings, we need an ecosystem that functions. We need a planet that functions. And we have driven the planet to the edge of disaster. So, when we rewrote the second book to include the pandemic, we didn't just include the pandemic. I mean, there's been 4 or 5 major disruptions. We had the pandemic, and then we had, in our country, we had the murder of a black man, George Floyd, which caused race riots in every city and burning of the city. So we have the whole social problem around race and equality that flared up. Then we've had in California massive fires. I'm sitting in my home office. It was noon last summer when the sky was black, and the fires created this orange glow. So we've got a massive climate crisis. Along with the pandemic came in a massive economic crisis, and so we've got a social crisis, an economic crisis, a climate crisis, and a global pandemic. All of these things require a holistic approach to design. So when I say human-centered. I think it doesn't, we've got to zoom back from the individual to the society at large and to the world at large, because what the pandemic has taught us is that just because you're okay in one part of the world, if it's raging in India, if it's raging in South America, then no one is safe. So you're absolutely right. And we teach our students now that design has to be sustainable. But and I think, to include sustainability in the definition is critical.
No. I think we all agree, and it's time to finish, unfortunately, because it was really great to listen to you. But I hope we will meet one day, maybe here in Poland or in San Francisco. But as of now, thank you again for opening our Discovery Lab event, and wish you all the best. Expecting your new book, and hoping to have it also in Polish. And thank you very much again for being with us.
You're welcome, and thank you for the invitation. And I will absolutely, the thing I miss the most is traveling. And when we do this next year, hopefully, if you are kind enough to invite me, I'd be happy to come to Poland or wherever you hold your next conference.
Okay, so we will come back to you then.
Okay.
Okay, thanks a lot.
All right, have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Okay.
Jaki jest punkt wyjścia dla innowacyjnych produktów i usług? Potrzeba, przeczucie, idea i ludzie, którzy powiedzą: to możliwe, zróbmy to.
Ale entuzjazm to nie wszystko. Potrzebujesz maszyn i narzędzi.
Potrzebujesz materiałów i przestrzeni do próbowania.
Przestrzeni do zmieniania i próbowania na nowo.
Potrzebujesz w każdym punkcie skończonego produktu lub usługi.
I miejsca, by je skończyć.
A potem,
Pokazać ludziom, przetestować i poprawić.
aż trafisz w punkt.